Sarah Mitchell had always been drawn to the sky, but not for the reasons most people assumed. It wasn't about speed or adrenaline or even the romance of flight that aviation magazines loved to romanticize. For her, flying was about silence. Up there, above the noise and chaos of the world below, she could finally breathe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 23, she was older than most student pilots at Henderson Flight Academy in Nevada. While her classmates were fresh-faced 19-year-olds dreaming of airline careers, Sarah carried herself with a quiet intensity that made instructors take notice. She never spoke about why she'd started flight training so late, never mentioned the 4 years that seemed to be missing from her resume, never explained the faint scar that ran along her left temple or why her hands never shook, even during her first solo flight. The other students whispered about her sometimes, how she could calculate wind vectors in her head faster than their flight computers, how she never seemed nervous, even when practicing emergency procedures that left others pale and sweating, how she always arrived early and stayed late, as if the cockpit was the only place she truly belonged. Sarah's apartment reflected the same careful distance she maintained from the world. Sparse, clean, functional, a pull-up bar in the doorway. A single bookshelf, filled with aviation manuals and weather theory textbooks. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that might hint at a life before Henderson. The only personal touch was a small cactus on the windowsill that somehow managed to thrive despite her frequent absences. She worked nights at a 24-hour diner called Murphy's, serving coffee to truckers and insomniacs. The job paid enough to cover rent and flight training, and the graveyard shift meant she could fly during the day when the academy was busy. Her manager, a gruff man named Pete who never asked questions, appreciated that she showed up on time and never called in sick. The regular customers knew her as the quiet waitress who could remember their orders after one visit and never tried to make small talk. But sometimes, late at night when the diner was empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of highway traffic, Sarah would find herself staring out the window at the stars. Her fingers would unconsciously trace patterns in the condensation on her coffee cup, patterns that looked suspiciously like flight formations. In those moments, something would flicker behind her eyes, a shadow of memory that she quickly pushed down. The flight academy was her sanctuary. Built on the edge of a small municipal airport 30 miles outside Las Vegas, Henderson Flight Academy trained pilots for commercial airlines, charter services, and the occasional wealthy amateur who wanted to impress friends with a private license. The facility consisted of a modest terminal building, 3 hangars, and a fleet of well-maintained Cessna 172s that had trained thousands of pilots over the years. Sarah's instructor was Captain Jake Reynolds, a former Air Force pilot who'd transitioned to civilian training after 20 years of military service. Reynolds had trained hundreds of students. But Sarah puzzled him. She absorbed information like a sponge, executed maneuvers with precision that took most students months to develop, and had an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that seemed almost supernatural. Yet she was always the first to deflect praise, always insisting she was just another student working toward her commercial license. "You've got natural stick and rudder skills," Reynolds had told her during her 3rd week of training. "Ever consider military flying?" Sarah had gone very still at the question, her hands tightening almost imperceptibly on the yoke. "Not interested," she'd replied in a tone that made it clear the subject was closed. Reynolds never brought it up again, but he noticed things. How Sarah's pre-flight inspections were thorough to the point of obsession. How she could identify aircraft by their engine sounds from miles away. How she instinctively checked 6 different escape routes every time they practiced landings at unfamiliar airfields. These weren't the habits of a typical student pilot. They were the reflexes of someone who'd learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. The other students at Henderson fell into predictable categories. There were the airline hopefuls, young men and women who dreamed of captain stripes and international routes. The weekend warriors, middle-aged professionals looking to recapture some sense of adventure. The trust fund kids whose parents thought flying lessons would teach responsibility. And then there was Sarah, who fit none of these molds and seemed content to remain an enigma. During ground school, while others struggled with navigation principles and federal aviation regulations, Sarah would sit quietly in the back, taking notes with mechanical precision. She never asked questions, but sometimes the instructors would catch her working through complex flight planning problems in the margins of her notebook, problems far beyond what they were teaching. When pressed, she would simply say she was curious about advanced topics. The truth was more complicated. Sarah's mind was constantly calculating angles, distances, fuel consumption rates, and weather patterns, because those calculations had once been a matter of life and death. She couldn't explain to her classmates that she'd learned to read clouds not from meteorology textbooks, but from flying missions, where the difference between cumulus and cumulonimbus could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her flight bag told its own story to anyone who knew how to read the signs. While other students carried the standard collection of charts, plotters, and brand new headsets, Sarah's equipment showed subtle modifications. Her sectional charts were marked with tiny notations in a shorthand that wasn't taught in any civilian navigation course. Her flight computer was a model that had been discontinued years ago, the kind used by military pilots who needed to calculate intercept courses and tactical approaches. Most telling of all was her headset, a civilian model that had been modified with military-grade noise cancellation and a boom mic positioned with the precision of someone accustomed to radio protocols far more complex than simple tower communications. The Academy's daily routine became Sarah's anchor to normalcy. Morning briefings at 7, pre-flight at 7:30, first lesson by 8. She would methodically work through the syllabus, basic flight maneuvers, navigation exercises, emergency procedures. Each lesson was a careful performance of being ordinary, of being just another student working toward her private pilot's license, with dreams of maybe flying charter flights someday. But late at night, when she thought no one was watching, Sarah would sometimes walk out to the flight line and stand beside the aircraft. She would run her hands along the wings, checking for imperfections that weren't there, testing control surfaces that had already been inspected. In the darkness, surrounded by sleeping planes, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be truly alive in the sky, to fly with purpose beyond recreation or career advancement. The Academy's location in Nevada meant dealing with challenging flying conditions. Desert thermals that could lift a small aircraft thousands of feet in minutes, sudden wind shear that tested even experienced pilots, mountain waves that could turn routine flights into white-knuckle adventures. While other students approached these conditions with appropriate caution, Sarah seemed to thrive in them. Reynolds noticed how she would actually smile during turbulence, how her flying became more precise when conditions deteriorated. "You handle rough air better than pilots, with 10 times your experience," he'd commented after a particularly challenging cross-country flight through mountain passes. "I just focus on the fundamentals," Sarah had replied. But Reynolds caught the way her eyes tracked distant aircraft, automatically cataloging their positions and vectors. Civilian pilots didn't maintain that level of tactical awareness unless they'd been trained to do so for very specific reasons. The small community around Henderson Academy had accepted Sarah as the quiet student who kept to herself. At Murphy's Diner, the truckers knew her as someone who poured good coffee and never judged their stories. At the Academy, she was the dedicated student who always arrived prepared and never caused problems. It was a carefully constructed life, built on the foundation of deliberate anonymity. But anonymity is a fragile thing, especially when you're trying to hide from people who are very good at finding things. Sarah had chosen Henderson specifically because it was small, remote, and unremarkable. The kind of place where someone could disappear into routine and emerge years later with a completely different identity. She'd been careful about everything, using cash whenever possible, maintaining minimal digital footprints, never staying in one place long enough to form deep connections. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd found peace in the sky when the sky was exactly where her old life would eventually catch up with her. But for now, in the controlled environment of student training flights, she could pretend that her biggest worry was passing her private pilot check ride. She could pretend that the complex calculations running through her head were about fuel consumption and flight times, not engagement envelopes and evasive maneuvers. 3 months into her training, Sarah had progressed faster than any student Reynolds had ever instructed. She was already practicing commercial maneuvers while still technically working on her private license. Her landings were consistently smooth, her navigation accurate to within meters, her emergency procedures executed with textbook precision. To outside observers, She was simply a gifted student pilot with natural aptitude. But gifts like Sarah's weren't natural. They were earned through training so intensive that it bordered on brutal, refined through experience that civilian pilots never encountered, and maintained through constant practice even during periods of supposed retirement. Every perfect landing, every flawless navigation exercise, every emergency procedure executed without hesitation was evidence of a past she was trying very hard to forget. The morning of October 15th started like any other at Henderson Flight Academy. Clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions for flight training. Sarah arrived early, as always, and began her pre-flight inspection with characteristic thoroughness. The Cessna 172 she'd been assigned was N739JM, a reliable trainer with just over 8,000 hours on the airframe. She checked the oil, tested the control surfaces, verified the fuel quantity, and reviewed the weather briefing. Reynolds met her at the aircraft, clipboard in hand, ready for another routine training flight. They would be practicing instrument approaches at nearby Minden Tahoe Airport, an exercise that would normally be unremarkable, except for the perfect flying conditions that made it almost too easy. "Beautiful day for flying," Reynolds commented as they completed their pre-flight checks. Sarah nodded, but something in her posture had changed. Almost imperceptibly, her scanning pattern had shifted from the casual awareness of a student pilot to the systematic surveillance of someone trained to detect threats. She was looking at the sky differently, reading it not just for weather but for signs of activity that didn't belong. "Everything okay?" Reynolds asked, noticing her distraction. "Just checking traffic," Sarah replied, but her eyes continued their methodical sweep of the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the ambient noise of the airport, engines were running that didn't sound quite right. Not civilian, not commercial, something else entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The radio crackled to life as Sarah and Reynolds climbed through 3,000 feet, heading northeast toward the practice area. What came through the speaker made Sarah's blood freeze. "All civilian aircraft. This is Nellis Air Force Base Control. Immediate notice. Unauthorized military aircraft have entered restricted airspace. All civilian traffic is ordered to land at the nearest suitable airport immediately." "This is not a drill." Reynolds frowned, reaching for his radio. "Nellis Control, Henderson Academy N739JM, requesting clarification on that last transmission." The response came quickly, but the voice was different now, tighter, more urgent. "Henderson N739JM, you are ordered to proceed directly to Henderson Field and land immediately. Do not deviate from the assigned heading. Military escort is being scrambled." Sarah's hands tightened on the controls. Military escort meant fighters, and fighters meant someone had detected a serious threat. But as she scanned the horizon, she saw something that made her stomach drop. 3 dark specks against the morning sky, flying in a formation that civilian controllers wouldn't recognize, but that she knew immediately. "Captain Reynolds," she said quietly, "those aren't our fighters." Reynolds squinted through the windscreen. "What do you mean?" "Nellis is scrambling." "Look at their approach vector," Sarah interrupted, her voice ticking on an edge of authority that Reynolds had never heard before. "They're coming from the northeast, not from Nellis. And that formation, it's not standard Air Force." The radio erupted again, this time with a transmission that chilled both pilots to the bone. "American aircraft, you will alter course immediately and follow us to the designated landing area. Any deviation will be considered a hostile act." Quote. The voice had a slight accent, and it definitely wasn't coming from any American military frequency. Reynolds grabbed the radio. "Who is this? Identify yourself." Sarah was already pushing the yoke forward, descending rapidly while scanning for terrain features that might provide cover. Her civilian training overlay was dropping away like a discarded mask, revealing reflexes and knowledge that belonged to a very different kind of pilot. "Reynolds, we need to get low now," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Those aircraft are hostile, and they're not interested in escorting us anywhere friendly." "What? How can you possibly know?" "Because I recognize the formation tactics," Sarah said, banking sharply toward a series of ridgelines that offered concealment. "That's a hunter-killer pattern. 2 aircraft maintain high cover while the lead closes for positive identification. It's a textbook, And it's not an American textbook. The lead aircraft was closing fast now, and through the Cessna's small windscreen, Sarah could see details that confirmed her worst fears. The sleek profile was unmistakably foreign, with weapon pylons that carried air-to-air missiles. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a training exercise gone wrong. These were enemy aircraft operating in American airspace, and somehow Sarah had stumbled into the middle of whatever operation they were conducting. "Civilian aircraft, you have 10 seconds to comply or we will open fire," the radio crackled. Reynolds looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "This can't be happening. This is impossible." Sarah was already diving toward the deck, using every foot of altitude to build speed. "Reynolds, I need you to listen very carefully. When I tell you, I want you to transmit on the emergency frequency. Tell them we have hostile aircraft engaging civilian traffic over Henderson practice area. Give them our position and tell them to scramble everything they have." "I don't understand how you—" "Just do it," Sarah snapped, pulling the Cessna into a sharp turn that stressed the airframe beyond normal training limits. "And then I need you to shut up and let me fly." The lead hostile aircraft had closed to within a mile, and Sarah could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. For a split second, their eyes met across the void, and she saw something that confirmed her darkest suspicions: recognition. The pilot knew exactly who she was. This wasn't a random encounter. They had been waiting for her. "Emergency! Emergency! This is Henderson N739JM, Reynolds transmitted, his voice shaking. "We have hostile military aircraft firing warning shots. Position 15 miles northeast of Henderson Field. Request immediate assistance." The response from Las Vegas approach was immediate and professional. "Henderson N739JM. Say again, did you say hostile aircraft?" Before Reynolds could respond, the radio was overwhelmed by electronic jamming, filling the cockpit with white noise that made further communication impossible. Sarah wasn't surprised. Professional military operations always included electronic warfare elements. "They're jamming us," she told Reynolds, who was staring at the radio in disbelief. "But that transmission got through. Help is coming." "How do you know all this?" Reynolds demanded. "Who are you?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was too busy flying the most important flight of her life, using terrain masking to break the visual contact that the hostile aircraft needed to maintain targeting solutions. The Cessna wasn't built for this kind of flying, but in the right hands, even a trainer could be surprisingly difficult to kill. "My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell," she said finally, pulling the aircraft through a canyon that was barely wide enough for the wingspan. "United States Air Force, 64th Aggressor Squadron. At least I used to be." Reynolds went pale. "Aggressor Squadron? But those are the pilots who train our fighters to fight against enemy tactics," Sarah finished. "Who knows every trick in the book because we've studied every potential adversary for the past decade. Who are specifically trained to think like the enemy because someone has to know how they fly." The canyon opened into a wider valley, and Sarah immediately pulled into a climbing turn, using the terrain to mask their signature while gaining altitude for maneuvering room. Behind them, she could hear the distinctive whine of jet engines as the hostile aircraft tried to follow their evasive course. "The Aggressor Squadron is classified," Reynolds said. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Sarah reached into her flight bag and pulled out a card that she'd hoped never to use again. It was laminated, official, and bore a seal that Reynolds recognized immediately. "Because 4 years ago, my squadron was disbanded after we uncovered evidence that our training data was being sold to foreign governments," Sarah said. "We were blamed for the security breach and scattered to the winds. Officially, we never existed. Unofficially, we've been hunted ever since." The hostile aircraft had regained visual contact, and Sarah could see missile smoke trails in the sky behind them. They weren't warning shots anymore. "They're shooting at us," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're shooting at me," Sarah corrected, rolling into a dive that used gravity to build speed beyond the Cessna's normal operating envelope. "You just had the bad luck to be my instructor today." The missiles passed overhead, their proximity fuses detonating in brilliant flashes that rocked the small aircraft. Sarah used the confusion to change course again, this time heading toward a series of radio towers that would complicate any further missile engagements. "Why?" Reynolds asked. "Why are they trying to kill you?" "Because I know things," Sarah said, threading the needle between two transmission towers while the hostile aircraft struggled to follow. I know how they think, how they fight, how they plan operations, and more importantly, I know who sold them our tactics in the first place. A new voice came through the static on the radio, clear and strong despite the jamming. Hostile aircraft in Henderson airspace. This is Viper Flight, U.S. Air Force. You are ordered to leave American airspace immediately, or you will be engaged. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. The cavalry had arrived, and it sounded like they'd brought F-16s to the party. The hostile aircraft immediately changed tactics, abandoning their pursuit of the Cessna and climbing rapidly toward the border. But the lead aircraft made one last transmission before disappearing into the distance. This is not over, Ghost. We know where you are now. Reynolds turned to stare at Sarah. Ghost? My call sign, she admitted, back when I had one. The radio crackled back to life as the jamming ceased. Henderson, N739JM, this is Viper Lead. Are you damaged? Do you require assistance? Sarah keyed the microphone. Viper Lead, this is Henderson, N739JM. We're okay, but I think we need to have a conversation when we get on the ground. Copy that. You're cleared directly to Nellis Air Force Base. We'll escort you in. 2 F-16s appeared off their wingtips, their pilots clearly visible in the cockpits. Sarah waggled the Cessna's wings in the traditional acknowledgement, and the fighters took up positions that provided both escort and surveillance. Nellis? Reynolds asked. They're taking us to a military base? They want answers, Sarah said. And frankly, so do I. Those aircraft knew exactly where to find me, which means someone has been tracking my movements, someone who knows enough about my past to set up an ambush. As they approached Nellis Air Force Base, Sarah could see activity on the ground that indicated a high level of alert. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway, and she counted at least a dozen fighters, either taking off or preparing for immediate launch. This is bigger than just me, she murmured. What do you mean? Reynolds asked. Those fighters that just attacked us, they weren't acting alone. This kind of operation requires extensive planning, intelligence gathering, and coordination. Someone has been preparing for this for months, maybe years. The F-16s guided them to a secure area of the base, away from normal flight operations. As they taxied to a stop, Sarah could see vehicles approaching with flashing lights and armed personnel. Reynolds, she said as they completed their shutdown checklist, I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. I just wanted to fly again, quietly, without anyone getting hurt. But now? Sarah looked out at the approaching vehicles, then at the weapons still visible on the F-16s that had escorted them. Now I think the quiet part of my life just ended. Men in military uniforms were surrounding the aircraft now, their weapons visible but not raised. This wasn't an arrest, but it was definitely not a casual debriefing either. Captain Mitchell, a voice called out as she opened the cabin door. Or do you prefer Ghost? The man approaching was a colonel, his uniform bearing the insignia of Air Force Intelligence. Behind him walked 2 individuals in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. I prefer Sarah, she replied, climbing down from the aircraft. And I assume you have questions. More than questions, the colonel said. We have a problem, a big one, and it appears you're right in the middle of it. Reynolds climbed down behind her, still visibly shaken by the morning's events. Colonel, I'm just a flight instructor. I don't know anything about any of this. Actually, Mr. Reynolds, you know more than you think, one of the civilian agents said. You've been training Captain Mitchell for 3 months. During that time, did you notice anything unusual about her flying skills? Well, yes, but did she ever mention her background? Display knowledge beyond what a typical student pilot would have? Reynolds glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. She's the best student pilot I've ever trained, but I thought she was just naturally gifted. Captain Mitchell, the colonel said, we need to discuss why enemy aircraft knew exactly where to find you, and why they seemed more interested in eliminating you than escaping our airspace. Sarah looked around at the assembled personnel, then up at the sky where contrails marked the paths of additional fighters maintaining patrol patterns. Colonel, before we discuss anything, I need to know one thing. How many other members of my old squadron have been attacked recently? The colonel's expression grew grim. You're the 3rd one this month. The other 2 didn't survive their encounters. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Then this isn't about revenge or tying up loose ends. Someone is systematically eliminating everyone who knew about the security breach. Which means, the federal agent added, that whatever you discovered 4 years ago is still relevant, still dangerous. And someone is willing to risk open combat in American airspace to keep it secret. Sarah looked back at the Cessna 172 that had carried her through the most dangerous flight of her civilian life. Then at Reynolds, who had been dragged into a world he never knew existed. "Colonel," she said finally, "I think we need to have a very long conversation about what really happened to the 64th Aggressor Squadron. Because if I'm right about who's behind this, those fighters we just encountered are only the beginning." The secure briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base felt like stepping back in time for Sarah. The familiar smell of military coffee mixed with electronics. The harsh fluorescent lighting. The heavy table surrounded by uncomfortable chairs that had hosted countless classified discussions. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it until she was sitting there again. Colonel Marcus Webb commanded the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with classified operations. Across from him sat Agent Diana Torres from the Defense Intelligence Agency and Agent Michael Chen from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. Reynolds sat beside Sarah, still processing the revelation that his best student pilot was actually a former military officer with a target on her back. "Let's start with what happened 4 years ago," Colonel Webb said, opening a thick file that Sarah recognized immediately. The 64th Aggressor Squadron was officially disbanded due to a security breach involving classified tactical data, but according to these records, you and your squadron mates claimed you were being framed. Sarah leaned forward. "We didn't claim anything, Colonel. We proved it. The problem was that the evidence pointed to someone so high up the chain of command that investigating further would have implicated half the Pentagon." Agent Torres pulled out a tablet and swiped through several documents. The official report says that squadron members were selling tactical information to foreign governments through intermediaries. Your squadron was flying against our best pilots, learning their weaknesses, and then allegedly passing that information to potential enemies. "The official report is garbage," Sarah said flatly. "We discovered that someone was selling information, but it wasn't anyone in our squadron. The data being sold included things we never had access to: strategic intelligence, operational plans, even the identities of deep cover operatives. We were tactical trainers, not intelligence officers." Agent Chen consulted his notes. "So you're saying the 64th was used as a scapegoat?" "I'm saying we got too close to the truth," Sarah replied. "We traced the information flow and discovered it was coming from inside the intelligence community itself. Someone with access to multiple classified systems was packaging and selling data to foreign buyers. When we tried to report it through proper channels, suddenly we were the ones under investigation." Colonel Webb frowned. "The investigators found evidence in squadron members' personal computers, financial records showing payments from shell companies. How do you explain that?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "The same way you explain enemy fighters knowing exactly where to find me this morning. Someone with serious resources and high-level access has been playing a very long game. They planted that evidence 4 years ago to destroy our credibility, then scattered us to make sure we couldn't compare notes or rebuild the case. And now they're killing you off," Reynolds said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "Sorry, but that's what this sounds like. If someone went to the trouble of framing your entire squadron, they wouldn't just stop there. They'd want to make sure none of you could ever resurface the evidence." Agent Torres nodded grimly. "Which brings us to today's attack. Our analysis of the radar data shows those aircraft entered American airspace from the north, flying low to avoid detection until they reached your position. They had your exact flight plan and timing." "Someone's been watching me," Sarah said, "probably for months. The question is how they got access to Henderson Academy's flight schedules." Colonel Webb pulled out another file. "We ran a security check on everyone with access to your training records. Your instructor, the scheduling office, maintenance personnel, even the other students. Everyone checked out clean." "Too clean?" Agent Chen asked. "Possibly, but there's another possibility we need to consider." The colonel looked directly at Sarah. "What if they weren't tracking you through the academy? What if they were tracking you through military channels?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "Your discharge papers, VA benefits, medical records, all of that creates a digital trail. If someone with access to military personnel systems wanted to find former 64th Squadron members, they could do it. But that would require," Sarah stopped, the implications hitting her, "that would require someone inside the military intelligence apparatus. Someone who's been there long enough to have access to historical records and current tracking systems." Agent Torres was typing rapidly on her tablet. I'm cross-referencing the timing of today's attack with recent access logs from military personnel databases. If someone's been fishing for 64th Squadron records, there should be a trail. While Torres worked, Colonel Webb continued the briefing. Captain Mitchell, we need to understand exactly what your squadron discovered 4 years ago. What evidence did you have that someone was selling classified information? Sarah closed her eyes, remembering details she'd tried to forget. It started with anomalies in training scenarios. We'd be briefed to fly against specific tactical approaches, but when we actually encountered foreign aircraft during joint exercises, they were using completely different methods. Methods that suggested they knew exactly how our pilots were trained to respond. That's pretty circumstantial, Agent Chen observed. It was, until Lieutenant Jason Ford started tracking communication patterns. Ford was our squadron's intelligence liaison, and he noticed that classified briefing materials were being accessed from IP addresses that didn't match any authorized military systems. Colonel Webb consulted his files. Lieutenant Ford, he was killed in a car accident 6 months after the squadron was disbanded. Accident, Sarah said bitterly. Single car, no witnesses, perfect weather conditions. Ford was the best driver in the squadron. He could handle a fighter jet but somehow lost control of his car on a straight stretch of highway? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Reynolds looked pale. Agent Torres looked up from her tablet. I've got something. Multiple queries for 64th Aggressor Squadron personnel records over the past 6 months. All from the same terminal at DIA headquarters. Defense Intelligence Agency, Colonel Webb muttered. Can you identify which terminal? Better than that. I can identify the user. Torres turned her tablet around to show the others. The queries were logged under the credentials of Deputy Director Robert Hawkins. Agent Chen whistled softly. Hawkins has been at DIA for 20 years. He'd have access to virtually everything, including the ability to plant evidence on squadron computers, Sarah added, and the connections to arrange for foreign aircraft to operate in American airspace. Colonel Webb stood up and began pacing. This is all speculation. We need proof before we can move against a deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Actually, Agent Torres said, we might have more than speculation. She was scrolling through more data on her tablet. The same terminal that accessed the squadron records also accessed flight training schedules for Henderson Academy. This morning, 2 hours before the attack. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. He's been tracking all of us. The other squadron members who were killed, he probably used the same method to find them. Which means he knows where the remaining squadron members are, Colonel Webb concluded. How many of you are still alive? Quote, Sarah thought carefully. Originally 12 pilots, plus Ford. Ford's dead, you said 2 others have been killed recently. That leaves 9 of us, assuming no one else has died since I've been off the grid. Agent Chen was making notes. We need to contact the other survivors immediately. Get them into protective custody before. An alarm began sounding throughout the base, and red lights started flashing in the corridors outside the briefing room. Colonel Webb grabbed a secure phone and punched in a number. This is Webb. What's our status? He listened for a moment, his face growing grim. How many? When? Roger, we're on our way. He hung up and looked at the others. We have multiple aircraft approaching from 3 different vectors. Electronic warfare signatures suggest they're jamming radar and communications across a 200-mile radius. They're not here for me this time, Sarah said, standing up. This is a full-scale operation. Agent Torres was already on her phone, trying to reach DIA headquarters. I'm getting no response from Washington. All communications appear to be jammed. Sarah moved to the window and looked out at the flight line. Aircraft were being armed and fueled at an accelerated pace, but something was wrong with the picture. Colonel, how many of those ground crew members have you personally verified? Webb followed her gaze. What do you mean? I count at least 6 people in ground crew uniforms that I don't recognize from when we landed, and they're working on aircraft that should already be combat ready. The colonel grabbed his radio. Security, this is Webb. I need immediate verification of all personnel on the flight line. Check everyone's credentials. But even as he spoke, Sarah could see small explosions occurring near several of the parked fighters. Not large enough to destroy the aircraft, but definitely sufficient to disable them. Sabotage, she said. They didn't just come to eliminate me. They came to neutralize our ability to respond to whatever they're really planning. Agent Chen was looking out another window. Colonel, we've got vehicles approaching the main gate. Military vehicles, but not ours. Webb's radio crackled with reports from around the base. Unauthorized personnel in multiple locations, suspicious activity near critical facilities, and communication systems being systematically jammed or disabled. This is a coordinated attack on a United States Air Force base, Webb said, his voice tight with controlled anger. But the attackers somehow have detailed knowledge of our layout, security procedures, and operational capabilities. Sarah turned away from the window. Because they've been planning this for 4 years. Ever since they realized that eliminating the 64th Squadron members one at a time was taking too long and risking exposure. So what's the real objective? Reynolds asked. Agent Torres looked up from her phone, her face pale. I just got a partial message before communications went down completely. There are similar attacks occurring at 3 other Air Force bases simultaneously. Nellis, Edwards, Luke, and Holloman. All bases with significant fighter assets, Colonel Webb observed. If they can disable our tactical air capabilities in the southwest, they'd have a clear corridor for something much larger, Sarah finished. This isn't about killing off the remaining squadron members. We're just the excuse they needed to justify a massive operation. The lights in the briefing room flickered and died, leaving them in emergency lighting. Through the windows, they could see flashes of gunfire and explosions across the base. Colonel, Sarah said, I know this base better than most of the people attacking it. I spent 6 months here during advanced tactical training. If you can get me to the flight line, I might be able to get some aircraft operational. Absolutely not. You're a civilian now. And this is a military installation under attack. I'm also the only person in this room who's actually flown combat missions against the tactics these people are using, Sarah replied. And right now, those aircraft on the flight line represent the only air assets that might still be operational. Agent Torres had moved to another window. Colonel, I think you need to see this. They gathered around her vantage point, which offered a view of the main runway. A large transport aircraft was approaching for landing, its profile clearly foreign and its size indicating it could carry a significant number of troops or equipment. They're not just attacking the base, Webb said grimly. They're occupying it. Sarah was already moving toward the door. Then we need to stop them before they can establish a foothold. Colonel, I'm going to the flight line with or without your permission, but I'd prefer to go with backup and a radio. Quote, Webb looked at the approaching transport, then at the reports of sabotage and infiltration coming through his radio, then back at Sarah. Agent Torres, Agent Chen, you're with Captain Mitchell. Reynolds, you stay here and coordinate with base security. I'm going to try to reach higher command and get reinforcements. Colonel, Sarah said as they prepared to leave the briefing room. When this is over, we're going to need to have a very serious conversation about Deputy Director Hawkins and how deep this conspiracy really goes. Assuming we survive the next few hours, Webb replied grimly. As they prepared to venture out into a military base under assault, Sarah felt familiar sensations returning. The heightened awareness, the tactical thinking, the cold calculation of risk versus necessity. Her civilian identity was completely gone now, replaced by the warrior she'd tried so hard to leave behind. But this time, she wasn't fighting for training scores or quarterly evaluations. She was fighting for her life, for the lives of her former squadron mates, and potentially for national security itself. The quiet student pilot from Henderson Academy no longer existed. Ghost was back in the game. The corridor leading from the briefing room to the flight line had become a war zone. Emergency lights cast eerie red shadows as Sarah, Agent Torres, and Agent Chen moved tactically through the base, using cover and concealment techniques that Sarah remembered from survival training. The sound of gunfire echoed from multiple directions, punctuated by explosions that shook the building's foundations. How many people are we dealing with? Agent Chen whispered as they paused at an intersection. Sarah held up her hand, listening carefully to the patterns of weapon fire. At least 30, maybe 40 attackers. But they're using our own security protocols against us. They know exactly where our defensive positions should be. Agent Torres checked her sidearm. Inside knowledge again? More than that, Sarah replied, peering around the corner. They're moving like they've trained here. This isn't just intelligence gathering. Someone has been preparing for this specific operation for months. The hallway ahead was clear, but Sarah could see scorch marks on the walls where grenades had detonated. Whoever was attacking Nellis wasn't interested in preserving the facility. They wanted it neutralized. As they moved deeper into the base, Sarah's radio crackled with fragmentary reports from Colonel Webb. Multiple breaches at the perimeter, communications tower destroyed, aircraft maintenance hangar occupied by hostiles. "Colonel," Sarah transmitted, "what's the status on the transport that was landing?" "Confirmed enemy aircraft. Discharged approximately 50 personnel before our remaining air defenses could engage. The transport was destroyed, but the personnel are now dispersed throughout the base." Agent Torres grabbed Sarah's arm. 50 people? This is a full military operation disguised as a terrorist attack." "No," Sarah said, pieces of the puzzle clicking together. "This isn't disguised as anything. This is exactly what it appears to be, a coordinated military strike using inside intelligence. The question is why they're willing to risk open warfare on American soil." They reached a maintenance door that led to the flight line. Through the reinforced glass, Sarah could see chaos. Several F-16s were burning, their fuel and ordnance creating spectacular fires that illuminated the night. But in the distance, she could make out at least 3 aircraft that appeared undamaged. "Those F-16s near Hangar 7, she told the agents. "If we can reach them, I might be able to get one airborne." Agent Chen looked skeptical. "You can just start up a military fighter?" "I logged over 300 hours in F-16s during my time with the aggressors," Sarah replied. "The question isn't whether I can fly one. It's whether they're fueled and armed." As they prepared to move onto the flight line, Agent Torres' secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. She read it quickly, then grabbed Sarah's shoulder. "I just received intelligence from Washington. The attacks on the other 3 bases have been successful. Edwards, Luke, and Holloman are all compromised. Whatever this operation is designed to accomplish, neutralizing our fighter assets in the southwest was just the first phase." Sarah felt cold dread in her stomach. "Torres, pull up a map of the region. Show me exactly which bases were hit and their geographic relationship." Agent Torres activated her phone's mapping function, marking the 4 bases under attack. The pattern was immediately obvious. A clear corridor running from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, with no significant air defense capabilities remaining. "They've opened an air corridor," Sarah breathed, 400 miles wide, stretching from Tijuana to Vancouver. "Whatever they're planning to bring through that corridor, it's big enough to require that much airspace." "Invasion?" Agent Chen asked. "Worse," Sarah replied. "Invasion forces would trigger a massive military response. This is something that needs to fly undetected, which means—" She stopped, her mind racing through possibilities that grew increasingly terrifying. "Sarah?" Agent Torres prompted. "Strategic assets. They're not bringing in troops. They're positioning weapons. Nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, something that would normally trigger every air defense system in North America." The radio crackled again. Colonel Webb's voice was strained with exhaustion and anger. "All units, be advised. We have confirmation that the attackers are using American military equipment and uniforms. Repeat, hostiles are using U.S. military gear." Agent Torres looked at Sarah grimly. "Inside support goes deeper than we thought." "It has to," Sarah said. "You can't acquire that kind of equipment without access to military supply chains. And you can't coordinate simultaneous attacks on 4 different bases without real-time intelligence from multiple sources." They moved through the maintenance door onto the flight line. The smell of burning fuel and electronics filled the air, mixed with something else that made Sarah's combat instincts scream warnings. She'd smelled that particular combination before, during chemical weapons training. "Gas masks," she ordered, pulling an emergency respirator from a nearby safety station. "They're using chemical agents to clear the flight line." Agent Chen followed her lead, donning protective equipment. "How do you know?" "Because that's what I would do," Sarah replied grimly. "Disable the aircraft first, then use non-lethal agents to incapacitate anyone trying to stop you. It's surgical, efficient, and minimizes the kind of massive casualties that would trigger an immediate nuclear response." They moved tactically across the tarmac, using damaged aircraft as cover. Sarah's mind was cataloging details automatically: wind direction, visibility, defensive positions, escape routes. Her civilian identity hadn't just been forgotten, it had been completely overwritten by years of military training. As they approached Hangar 7, Agent Torres spotted movement in the shadows. "Contacts, 2 o'clock." Sarah raised her acquired M4 rifle and peered through the scope. 3 figures in American military uniforms were placing charges on the landing gear of an undamaged F-16. "They're not just disabling aircraft," she whispered. "They're making sure nothing can be repaired quickly." Agent Chen aimed his weapon. "Orders?" Sarah studied the tactical situation. The 3 hostiles were focused on their sabotage work, unaware of being observed. Taking them out would eliminate an immediate threat but might alert other attackers in the area. "Torres, what's the current status of backup from other military installations?" "All communications with the outside are still jammed. As far as we know, no one beyond this base is aware of the attacks." Sarah made her decision. "We take them quietly. Chen, circle left. Torres, provide overwatch. I'm going direct." Moving with the fluid precision of someone trained in close-quarters combat, Sarah approached the saboteurs from their blind spot. Years of civilian life hadn't dulled her edge. If anything, the recent months of hiding had sharpened her survival instincts. The first hostile never saw her coming. A silenced shot from Sarah's acquired pistol dropped him instantly. The second turned at the sound of his partner falling, but Agent Chen's position gave him a clean shot. The third saboteur tried to run, but found Agent Torres blocking his escape route. "Hands up now," Torres commanded. The man raised his hands but was reaching for something. A detonator. Sarah's rifle cracked once and the threat was eliminated. "Check the charges," Sarah ordered, moving to secure the area. Agent Chen examined the explosives while Sarah searched the bodies. What she found confirmed her worst fears. "Chinese military identification," she announced, holding up credentials taken from the first attacker. "But they're carrying American weapons and wearing American uniforms." Agent Torres looked up from examining the detonator. "This is sophisticated stuff, military-grade explosives with remote activation capability. Which means there are probably charges on every remaining aircraft," Sarah concluded. "They can destroy everything simultaneously if they need to." Sarah's radio buzzed with an encrypted transmission that somehow cut through the jamming. The voice was distorted but recognizable. "Ghost, this is Raven. Do you copy?" Sarah's blood froze. Raven was the call sign of Major Lisa Park, another member of the 64th Aggressor Squadron. She was supposed to be dead. "Raven, this is Ghost. Confirm your identity. Serial number 2847, Delta 991. We served together at Nellis from 2019 to 2021. Your favorite pre-flight meal was black coffee and stale donuts from the base exchange." It was definitely Lisa, but that raised more questions than it answered. "Raven, where are you? We were told you were killed last month." "Negative, Ghost. I've been deep undercover for the past 6 months, investigating the same conspiracy that destroyed our squadron. I'm currently observing the operation from outside the base perimeter." Agent Torres grabbed Sarah's arm. "This could be a trap." Sarah considered the possibility, then keyed her radio again. "Raven, what's the tactical situation from your perspective?" "Multiple staging areas with heavy equipment. I count at least 12 aircraft of various types positioned north of the base. This isn't just an attack, Ghost. It's a full-scale occupation force." "Occupation for what purpose?" "Unknown, but I've been tracking their communications. They're expecting additional assets to arrive within the next 2 hours. Something big enough to require a secure airfield and complete communications blackout." Sarah processed this information rapidly. "Raven, can you confirm the identity of the operation commander?" There was a pause before Lisa responded. "Negative visual on command personnel, but I intercepted encrypted communications using protocols that match Defense Intelligence Agency standards." Agent Torres had been monitoring multiple radio frequencies. "Sarah, I'm picking up transmissions from the other compromised bases. It sounds like they're all reporting successful occupations." "Which means the air corridor is now open," Sarah concluded. "Raven, we need to coordinate a response before whatever they're bringing through that corridor arrives." "Ghost, I've been tracking aircraft movements for the past week. There are at least 6 heavy transport aircraft currently en route from an unknown origin, ETA, approximately 90 minutes. Sarah looked at the damaged F-16s around them, then at the few aircraft that might still be operational. "Torres, Chen, we need to get word to the Pentagon immediately. This isn't just an attack on military bases. It's preparation for something much larger." Agent Chen had been working on alternative communications equipment. I might be able to reach Washington using a military satellite uplink from the command bunker, but we'd have to cross the entire base under hostile fire. Quote, "Then that's what we do," Sarah said. "But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She moved to examine the sabotage equipment more carefully. The explosives were professionally placed, the detonators were military grade, and the timing suggested careful coordination. But there was something else, markings on the equipment that didn't match any standard military inventory. "Torres, look at this." Sarah pointed to a serial number on one of the detonators. "This equipment was manufactured specifically for this operation. It's not stolen military hardware, it's custom-built." "Which means someone has been planning this for years, not months," Agent Torres concluded. "And they have access to manufacturing capabilities that rival military contractors," Agent Chen added. Sarah's radio crackled again. This time it was Colonel Webb. "All surviving personnel, fall back to the command bunker. We're going to attempt to contact higher command and coordinate a response." "Colonel, this is Ghost. We're at Hangar 7 with intelligence that indicates this operation is preparation for incoming strategic assets. We need to warn Washington immediately." "Acknowledged, Ghost. Can you make it to the command bunker?" Sarah looked across the base at the fires and explosions that marked ongoing combat. The command bunker was at least half a mile away, through territory now controlled by hostile forces. "We can make it, Colonel, but we're going to need covering fire and a very good plan." As they prepared to move across the contested base, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The attack was too sophisticated, too well coordinated, and too perfectly timed to be the work of any known terrorist organization. "Torres," she said as they gathered their equipment, "when this is over, we need to dig deeper into Deputy Director Hawkins' background. I'm starting to think the 64th Aggressor Squadron stumbled onto something much bigger than selling tactical information." "What do you mean?" Sarah looked up at the sky, where distant aircraft lights were beginning to appear. "I think we discovered a conspiracy to fundamentally compromise American air defense capabilities. And now, 4 years later, that conspiracy is about to achieve its ultimate objective." The command bunker at Nellis Air Force Base was a fortress buried 30 feet underground, designed to survive direct nuclear attack. But as Sarah, Agent Torres, and Agent Chen fought their way through hostile-controlled territory to reach it, she realized that conventional defenses meant nothing when the enemy had intimate knowledge of every weakness. Colonel Webb met them at the reinforced entrance, his uniform torn and blackened with smoke. "Thank God you made it. We've lost contact with the Pentagon, NORAD, and Strategic Command. Whatever jamming technology they're using is unlike anything we've encountered." "Because it's our own technology," Sarah replied grimly, "turned against us by someone who helped design it." Inside the bunker, the situation was desperate. Of the base's original complement of 300 personnel, fewer than 50 had made it to the secure facility. Most were wounded. All were exhausted, and their commanding officer was barely maintaining cohesion among survivors who'd watched their installation fall to attackers wearing American uniforms. "Sir," Agent Torres addressed Colonel Webb, "we have intelligence indicating that incoming aircraft will arrive within the hour. We need to establish communication with the outside immediately." Webb led them to the communications center, where technical specialists were working frantically to break through the electronic interference. "Every conventional channel is blocked. They've created an electromagnetic dead zone covering nearly 1,000 square miles." Sarah studied the equipment. "What about emergency frequencies? Military satellite links that don't rely on ground-based relay stations?" "All compromised," Webb replied. Whoever planned this operation knew exactly which systems to target first. Agent Chen was examining classified manuals spread across a nearby table. "Colonel, these are tactical communications protocols. How did hostile forces acquire detailed knowledge of our emergency backup systems?" Before Webb could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the bunker. Red lights flashed as automated systems detected incoming aircraft. On the main display screen, radar contacts appeared from multiple directions. 12 large aircraft approaching from the south, flying in tight formation. "That's our incoming strategic assets," Sarah said, watching the display. "Whatever they're carrying, it's about to arrive." A technician at the radar console looked up with confusion. "Sir, these aircraft are broadcasting American military identification codes." According to our computers, these are authorized U.S. Air Force transports. Sarah felt ice in her veins. They're not just using our equipment and uniforms. They've compromised our identification systems. Those aircraft will be waved through by any remaining air defense installations. Colonel Webb grabbed a secure phone and tried multiple numbers. Each call failed to connect. We're completely isolated. Even if we could get word out, who would believe that 12 American military transports are actually enemy aircraft? Agent Torres had been monitoring intelligence feeds on her encrypted device. Suddenly, her face went pale. I'm receiving fragmentary reports from other installations. Similar communications blackouts at Peterson Air Force Base, Cheyenne Mountain, and Malmstrom. The pattern is expanding beyond the southwest. They're not just opening an air corridor, Sarah realized. They're systematically blinding our entire air defense network. The bunker shook as explosions echoed from above. Through the ventilation system, they could hear the distinctive whine of jet engines as aircraft began landing on the compromised runway. Whatever they're unloading, it's happening now, Agent Chen observed. Sarah moved to a periscope that provided limited visual access to the surface. Through the armored glass, she could see the massive transport aircraft disgorging equipment and personnel. But what she observed made her stomach drop. Colonel, you need to see this. Webb looked through the periscope, then stepped back with a grim expression. Those are intercontinental ballistic missile components, mobile launchers, command vehicles, and what appears to be nuclear warheads. Impossible, Agent Torres said. You can't just transport nuclear weapons in cargo aircraft. You can if you're working with someone who has the authorization codes to move strategic assets, Sarah replied. And if you've compromised the tracking systems that monitor nuclear materials. The realization hit everyone simultaneously. This wasn't an invasion or a terrorist attack. It was a nuclear deployment operation using legitimate American military assets and authorization codes. Colonel Webb was frantically working communications equipment. We have to reach someone, if those weapons become operational. They already are operational, Sarah said, continuing to observe through the periscope. Those launchers are being positioned for immediate use. Launch preparation time for mobile ICBMs is less than 30 minutes. Quote. Agent Chen grabbed Sarah's arm. Targets? Unknown, but based on the positioning, they could reach any major city on the West Coast, or... Sarah paused, calculating trajectories. Or any military installation capable of launching a retaliatory strike. A new voice came through the bunker's internal communications system. The speaker was calm, professional, and speaking with a clear American accent. Personnel in the command bunker, this is General Patricia Hayes, United States Air Force. You are ordered to surrender immediately. The facility you are defending has been designated as compromised by foreign agents, and this operation has full Pentagon authorization. Colonel Webb looked stunned. General Hayes is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. If she's ordering our surrender, she's either compromised or she's part of the conspiracy, Sarah said flatly. Colonel, how long have you known General Hayes? 20 years. She's one of the most respected officers in the Air Force. Agent Torres was checking her intelligence databases. General Hayes disappeared from Washington 3 days ago. Her staff reported she was on a classified inspection tour of Western installations. Because she was, Sarah said, she was inspecting the targets for this operation. The communication system crackled again. Colonel Webb, this is General Hayes. I'm giving you 5 minutes to open the bunker and surrender. Failure to comply will result in the use of specialized ordnance to breach your defenses. Sarah turned to face the others. Specialized ordnance means they have bunker-busting weapons. This facility won't protect us if they're determined to eliminate witnesses. Witnesses to what? Webb asked. To the fact that the United States military just deployed nuclear weapons on American soil under the authorization of compromised or complicit senior officers, Agent Torres said. Sarah was studying technical manuals. Colonel, does this bunker have independent communications capability? Something that doesn't rely on external infrastructure. Emergency beacon system. Direct satellite uplink with encoding that can't be jammed. But it's only designed for doomsday scenarios. This qualifies, Sarah replied grimly. Webb led them to a heavily secured section of the bunker. Behind multiple locks and biometric scanners was a communication system that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. "This is the Emergency Action Communications System," Webb explained. "Direct link to the President, Joint Chiefs, and Strategic Command. But activating it triggers automatic protocols that assume we're under nuclear attack." "We are under nuclear attack," Agent Chen pointed out. "It's just not coming from a foreign country." Sarah was examining the system's technical specifications. "How long does it take to establish contact?" 60 seconds for satellite acquisition, another 30 for authentication and encryption handshake." "Do it." Webb hesitated. "Sarah, if I activate this system and we're wrong about what's happening up there, then we'll face court-martial proceedings," Sarah said. "But if we're right and we don't activate it, there won't be anyone left to hold a court-martial." Colonel Webb made his decision. He placed his palm on the biometric scanner, entered authorization codes, and activated the Emergency Action Communication System. While they waited for satellite contact, Sarah continued observing the surface through the periscope. The missile launchers were nearly in position, and she could see technicians making final preparations for launch. "Colonel," she said urgently, "how many nuclear weapons are stored at this facility?" "None. Nellis doesn't house strategic weapons." "Then where did those warheads come from?" Agent Torres was monitoring her intelligence feeds. "Multiple reports of missing nuclear materials from storage facilities across the country. Malmstrom, Minot, Warren. Materials that disappeared during routine transfer operations. Transfer operations authorized by senior officers with appropriate clearances," Agent Chen added. The communication system beeped, indicating successful satellite contact. A voice came through the speakers that Sarah recognized immediately. "This is Stratcom Emergency Command. Authenticate." Colonel Webb provided his authorization codes and personal identification. There was a pause, then a different voice came through the system. "Colonel Webb, this is General Morrison, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Report your status." "Sir, Nellis Air Force Base has been compromised by hostile forces deploying strategic weapons on American soil. We have nuclear-capable missiles being prepared for launch at our location." "Colonel, we show no unauthorized weapons deployment. All strategic assets are accounted for and under proper command authority." Sarah grabbed the microphone. "General Morrison, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell, formerly of the 64th Aggressor Squadron. The weapons deployment is being conducted under compromised authorization codes by hostile forces using legitimate American military equipment and personnel." There was a long pause. "Captain Mitchell, according to our records, you were discharged from military service 4 years ago following security violations." "Sir, those violations were fabricated to cover up a conspiracy within the Defense Intelligence Agency. Deputy Director Robert Hawkins has been selling classified information and compromising strategic operations for years. Captain Mitchell, Deputy Director Hawkins is currently in this room participating in our response to the crisis at Nellis." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. If Hawkins was at Stratcom headquarters, if he was part of the response team. "General," she said carefully, "what is the official status of the operation at Nellis Air Force Base?" "Classified counterintelligence operation designed to identify and eliminate remaining members of a compromised military unit. The 64th Aggressor Squadron has been designated a security threat, and operations to neutralize that threat are ongoing." Sarah looked at Colonel Webb, Agent Torres, and Agent Chen. They were all staring at her with a growing understanding of just how deep the conspiracy reached. "Sir," Sarah said into the microphone, "what are your orders regarding the nuclear weapons currently being deployed at this location?" "There are no nuclear weapons at Nellis Air Force Base, Captain, and there are no hostile forces. You are the hostile forces." The communication system went dead. Outside, the missile launchers had completed their positioning, and launch preparation was entering final stages. Sarah realized that they weren't just fighting a conspiracy, they were fighting their own government, which had been systematically compromised from the highest levels of command. "Colonel," she said quietly, "I think we're on our own." The silence in the bunker was deafening after the communication system went dead. Sarah stared at the equipment that had just confirmed their worst nightmare. They weren't fighting foreign enemies. They were fighting their own government, corrupted from within by a conspiracy that reached the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. 20 minutes, Agent Torres said, checking her watch. "That's how long those missiles need to complete launch preparation." Quote. Colonel Webb slumped against the wall, Even if we could reach the surface, what could we do against nuclear weapons with small arms? Sarah was studying technical diagrams of the base infrastructure. The missiles need external guidance systems to reach their targets, satellite uplinks, GPS receivers, targeting computers. All of that requires power and communication lines that run through this facility. Agent Chen looked up from monitoring radio frequencies. You're talking about sabotaging the base's primary electrical systems? I'm talking about saving American cities from nuclear attack by whatever means necessary, Sarah replied. Torres, can you access the base power grid from these terminals? Agent Torres moved to the engineering console. I can see the primary distribution network, but shutting down power would also disable life support in this bunker. Then we have maybe 10 minutes before we lose oxygen, Colonel Webb calculated. Not enough time to reach the surface and escape the blast radius. Sarah pulled out her phone and activated an encrypted messaging app she'd hoped never to use again. Raven, this is Ghost. Do you copy? Major Lisa Park's voice came through clearly. Ghost, I'm here. What's your situation? We're trapped in the command bunker, with hostile nuclear weapons being prepared for launch. I need you to create a distraction large enough to disrupt their operations. What kind of distraction? Sarah looked at the others, knowing what she was about to ask would likely be a suicide mission. Can you reach the fuel depot? There was a pause before Lisa responded. Affirmative. But Ghost, if I detonate aviation fuel tanks, the explosion will level half the base. Including the missile launchers and their control systems, Sarah said grimly. Lisa, those weapons are targeting American cities. We can't let them launch. Understood. Give me 5 minutes to reach the depot. Colonel Webb grabbed Sarah's arm. You're asking her to commit suicide, and the explosion will kill everyone in this bunker. Colonel, if those missiles launch, millions of people will die. If we stop them here, only we die. Agent Torres had accessed the power grid controls. Sarah, I found something. The missiles are drawing power from the base grid, but they also have independent battery systems. Cutting the main power won't stop the launch. But it will disrupt their guidance systems, Sarah realized. They'll launch blind, without target coordinates. Quote, Agent Chen was monitoring surface communications. Ghost, I'm picking up launch preparation commands. They're entering the final countdown. Sarah keyed her radio. Raven, we're out of time. Execute now. Roger. Ghost, it's been an honor. Through the bunker's seismic sensors, they felt a massive explosion as Major Lisa Park detonated the aviation fuel depot. The blast wave shook the entire facility, and emergency lighting flickered throughout the command center. Agent Torres was working frantically at the power controls. The explosion damaged their primary guidance array, but backup systems are still online. I need 30 more seconds to isolate the missile control circuits. We don't have 30 seconds. Agent Chen reported. Launch sequence is at T-minus 60 seconds. Sarah made a decision that went against every survival instinct. She moved to the bunker's emergency exit, a tunnel that led to the surface near the missile positions. Where are you going? Colonel Webb demanded. To finish what Lisa started, Sarah replied, grabbing emergency equipment from a storage locker. Torres, when I give the signal, cut all power to the base. Everything. Sarah, that's suicide. The missiles will launch whether we stop them or not now. Not if I can physically disable their guidance systems. Sarah was suiting up in protective gear designed for chemical attacks. Those missiles need precise targeting data to hit their intended targets. Without it, they'll either fail to launch or crash harmlessly in the desert. Agent Torres completed her power grid analysis. I can give you maybe 3 minutes before backup systems restore missile guidance. After that, nothing will stop the launch. Sarah opened the emergency tunnel hatch. The passage was filled with smoke and debris from Lisa's sacrifice, but it was still passable. Ghost, wait! Agent Chen handed her a small device. Emergency beacon. If you succeed in stopping the missiles, activate this. It'll transmit on frequencies that can't be jammed, calling in real military units that aren't compromised. Sarah took the beacon and looked back at the 3 people who'd followed her into this nightmare. Torres, Chen, Colonel Webb. When this is over, make sure the world knows what really happened here. Make sure the 64th Aggressor Squadron is cleared of all charges. You're not going to die down there, Colonel Webb said firmly. That's an order. Sarah managed a grim smile. Since I'm technically a civilian, I don't have to follow orders anymore. She climbed into the tunnel and began making her way toward the surface. The passage was partially collapsed from the fuel depot explosion, but Sarah's survival training guided her through obstacles that would have stopped most people. She emerged near the missile positions just as the countdown reached T-minus 30 seconds. The launchers were automated now, their crews having withdrawn to safe distances. But Sarah could see the guidance array antennas that connected the missiles to their targeting systems. Using demolition charges from the emergency kit, she began placing explosives on the critical communication links between the missiles and their control computers. 20 seconds. 15. 10. At T-minus 5 seconds, Sarah detonated the charges and dove for cover behind a concrete barrier. The missiles launched, but without guidance data, they flew erratic paths before crashing harmlessly in the Nevada desert, their nuclear warheads remaining inert without proper arming signals. Sarah activated the emergency beacon, just as hostile forces surrounded her position. But the signal had been transmitted, and within minutes, the distinctive sound of Apache helicopters filled the air as real American military forces arrived on scene. The battle for Nellis Air Force Base was over. The conspiracy that had corrupted the highest levels of government was exposed when forensic analysis of the missile components revealed they had been acquired through forged authorization codes created within the Defense Intelligence Agency. Deputy Director Robert Hawkins was arrested at STRATCOM headquarters when investigators discovered he had been using legitimate military operations to cover illegal weapons transfers for years. General Patricia Hayes was found dead in her aircraft, apparently having realized the scope of her involvement and chosen suicide over capture. As Sarah was debriefed by investigators, she learned the full extent of the conspiracy. The 64th Aggressor Squadron had indeed discovered evidence of weapons sales to foreign governments, but they had only seen the tip of the iceberg. The real operation involved systematically compromising American nuclear security to enable foreign powers to position strategic weapons on U.S. soil. The irony, Agent Torres told her during the investigation, is that by scattering your squadron and making you all go underground, they actually prevented you from exposing the full conspiracy sooner. Sarah looked out the window at Henderson Flight Academy, where her simple life as a student pilot now seemed like a distant memory. Maybe that was the point. Keep us isolated and afraid while they complete their real objective. 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell was officially reinstated as Captain Mitchell, United States Air Force, with full honors and back pay. The 64th Aggressor Squadron was not only cleared of all charges, but was reformed with enhanced security protocols to prevent similar infiltration. But Sarah chose not to return to active duty. Instead, she accepted a position as a civilian contractor, training new pilots to recognize and counter the sophisticated threats that could emerge from within their own systems. Because she had learned that the most dangerous enemies aren't always the ones flying toward you from foreign skies. Sometimes, they're the ones sitting in the briefing room, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same clearances, and planning to destroy everything you've sworn to protect. Sarah Mitchell had started as a nobody in row 9 of a civilian aircraft. She had ended as the woman who saved American cities from nuclear attack by foreign agents operating within the highest levels of her own government. But most importantly, she had proven that sometimes the most crucial battles aren't fought in the sky. They're fought by ordinary people who refuse to let extraordinary evil succeed, regardless of how high up the chain of command that evil reaches. The sky would always call to her, but now she knew that her real mission was teaching others to recognize when that call was coming from the wrong voices, with the wrong intentions, carrying the wrong orders. Some fights are worth losing everything for, and sometimes losing everything is the only way to save what really matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.